Welcome back to Klepper's Corner. Today in history, March 17th, a date widely known for green beer, questionable decisions, and people discovering they are 1/16th Irish for exactly 12 hours. But behind the parades and shamrocks lies something far more interesting. A historical pressure point where empires collapse, nations form, science rewrites reality, and occasionally someone invents the rubber band, which, if you think about it, is the most historically accurate symbol of humanity, constantly stretching until something snaps. So today we're exploring the strange architecture of March 17th. Because history doesn't move in a straight line. It zigzags, it stumbles, and sometimes it gets drunk at a parade and accidentally invents quantum mechanics. Segment 1, when empires crack. Let's start in ancient Rome. Because if you want a lesson in how power works and fails, you start with the people who basically invented political drama. On March 17th, 45 BC, Julius Caesar won the Battle of Munda in Spain, crushing the last resistance from supporters of Pompey. This was Caesar's final military victory, and it effectively ended the Roman Republic. Which sounds dramatic, but if you know Roman politics, ending the Republic was basically their version of changing the office coffee machine. Everyone complained about the system until one guy just took over. After Munda, Caesar returned to Rome with absolute power and the title Dictator for Life, which sounds impressive until you remember the Roman Senate had a performance review system called stabbing. And sure enough, 2 days before the next March 17th, the Ides of March happened. But the Roman drama doesn't stop there. Jump ahead to March 17th, 180 AD, when Marcus Aurelius died and his son Commodus became emperor. Marcus Aurelius had been the philosopher king, the Stoic, writing wisdom about discipline and duty. His son Commodus preferred fighting gladiators in the arena and declaring himself a living god. Imagine inheriting the Roman Empire and deciding your career path is professional WWE emperor. Historians often point to Commodus as the moment Rome's golden age ended, which is also a reminder that dynastic succession is the historical equivalent of giving your company to the kid who thinks TikTok is a management strategy. And if you want proof Rome was unraveling, look at March 17th, 455 AD, when a man named Petronius Maximus seized power during chaos and forced the emperor's widow into marriage to legitimize himself. His reign lasted 2 months. 2 months. That's not a reign, that's a free trial. When the Vandals approached Rome, a mob killed him in the street. Rome didn't collapse overnight. It slowly devolved into the political version of a group chat where nobody is in charge. Segment 2, empires, colonies, and the borders nobody asked for. Fast forward to the age of empires, when Europeans started redrawing the world map like it was a whiteboard at a corporate meeting. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition reached the Philippine archipelago during the first circumnavigation of the globe. Magellan was searching for a western route to the Spice Islands and accidentally helped launch the first truly global trade network. And nothing says exploration quite like arriving somewhere and immediately starting a colonial empire. Spain eventually turned Manila into a global trade hub, connecting Asia, the Americas, and Europe, which means globalization basically began with spices, ships, and a shocking lack of permission from the locals. Then we jump to March 17th, 1757, when the Dutch East India Company helped partition the Mataram Sultanate in Java. Colonialism often gets summarized as conquest, but it was also strategy. The Dutch realized it was easier to control the region if local rulers were divided into smaller rival states. Divide and rule, the geopolitical equivalent of putting your enemies in a group project together. But perhaps the most consequential line drawn on March 17th happened in 1824 with the Anglo-Dutch Treaty. British and Dutch diplomats met in London and split Southeast Asia into spheres of influence. The British took Singapore and Malacca, while the Dutch secured Sumatra and the Indonesian islands. And just like that, 4 diplomats reshaped the political map of Southeast Asia. The modern borders of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore can trace their roots to that treaty, which is wild when you think about it. Millions of people living within borders drawn by guys who probably thought the tropics were a kind of fruit. Segment 3. Revolutions and the birth of nations. March 17th also shows up repeatedly in the story of nation building. In 1766, the British Parliament repealed the Stamp Act after massive protests in the American colonies. Colonists celebrated, but Parliament immediately passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to govern the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Britain was essentially saying, fine, we'll cancel the tax, but we still own you, which is a bold diplomatic move if your long-term goal is eventually losing 13 colonies. Exactly 10 years later, on March 17, 1776, the British evacuated Boston after George Washington's forces fortified Dorchester Heights with artillery hauled from Fort Ticonderoga. This was a huge psychological victory for the Continental Army, proving the rebels could outmaneuver the British military. It also proved something else. Never underestimate what Americans will accomplish when they drag heavy equipment across impossible terrain. Then we jump to Europe in 1861, when the Kingdom of Italy was officially proclaimed. Italy had previously been a patchwork of kingdoms and duchies dominated by foreign powers. But the Risorgimento movement unified the peninsula under King Victor Emmanuel II. It was the political equivalent of assembling IKEA furniture, except instead of Allen wrenches, it involved revolutions, wars, and Giuseppe Garibaldi leading volunteer armies called the Red Shirts. The result was a new European power and a unified Italian identity, which also meant Europe now had to deal with Italian politics, a system that would eventually produce coalition governments that collapsed faster than Roman emperors. Segment 4. Science rewrites reality. Now let's pivot from politics to science, because March 17th also helped rewrite the laws of the universe. In 1905, Albert Einstein completed a paper explaining the photoelectric effect. At the time, physicists believed light behaved purely as a wave, but experiments showed something strange. Low-frequency light couldn't knock electrons off metal surfaces, no matter how bright it was. Einstein proposed that light sometimes behaves like particles, tiny packets of energy called photons. The equation was simple. Energy equals Planck's constant times frequency. That insight helped launch quantum mechanics, which means the entire modern technological world, from semiconductors to solar panels, started because Einstein looked at a weird physics experiment and basically said, okay, what if light is doing something extremely strange? Ironically, Einstein won the Nobel Prize for that discovery, rather than for relativity. Relativity changed how we understand space and time, but the photoelectric effect gave us solar panels, lasers, and electronics. And let's be honest, history tends to reward the invention that lets people charge their phones. March 17th also marks major leaps in space exploration. In 1958, the United States launched Vanguard 1, one of the first solar-powered satellites. It weighed just 3 pounds, but it proved solar panels could power spacecraft for years. And in 2011, NASA's Messenger spacecraft became the first probe to orbit Mercury, navigating one of the most difficult orbital insertions ever attempted. Humanity sent a robot millions of miles through space just to map a planet we can barely see from Earth. Which proves two things. Human curiosity is unstoppable, and NASA engineers really enjoy extremely difficult puzzles. Segment 5, the 20th century's turning points. Finally, March 17th has also hosted some major moments of modern geopolitics. In 1959, the Dalai Lama fled Tibet after Chinese forces shelled the area near his palace in Lhasa. Disguised as a soldier, he escaped across the Himalayas into India, beginning an exile that transformed the Tibetan conflict into a global human rights issue that continues today. Then, in 1973, American prisoners of war were released from the Hanoi Hilton following the Paris Peace Accords. One famous photograph from that moment, Burst of Joy, shows a pilot running toward his family after years in captivity, becoming one of the defining emotional images of the Vietnam War. In a cruel twist of fate, the pilot had received a Dear John letter days before the reunion, reminding us that history often delivers moments that are simultaneously triumphant and painfully human. And in 1992, South Africa held a referendum among white voters on whether to dismantle apartheid. Nearly 70% voted yes, paving the way for the multiracial elections that would bring Nelson Mandela to power 2 years later. It was one of the rare moments where a system of oppression ended through democratic consent rather than violent revolution, proving that sometimes history does move forward, not through war, but through ballots. In conclusion, March 17th isn't just St. Patrick's Day. It's a historical crossroads where empires collapsed, nations were born, science changed reality, and humanity took a few more unpredictable steps forward. From Caesar's final victory to Einstein's quantum breakthrough, from colonial treaties to democratic revolutions, this single date reveals something profound about how history actually moves. The biggest changes rarely arrive neatly scheduled. They emerge from chaos, ambition, discovery, and sometimes pure accident. Which means, if history has taught us anything, it's this. Today might look ordinary, but somewhere, someone is probably inventing the next world-changing idea, or accidentally starting the next empire. And hopefully, doing it before the parade starts.